Hello and welcome to the Kent History Channel. My name is George Chittenden. I'm a national award-winning tour guide, historian and novelist. Living in Kent, we're very privileged to have such rich and diverse history, and it's in my opinion that this area has more history than anywhere on earth. So over the next few weeks, I'll be taking you all on a journey through time. In this week's 10-minute episode, we'll be looking at the County of Kent's shady smuggling past, and at an era when criminal gangs controlled our coastlines through a combination of bribery and violence, bringing in contraband across the English Channel and of course avoiding the dreaded tax. When you look at the landscape of Kent, you can easily see the benefits offered to the enterprising smuggler. To the east lies the coast of northern France, the source of cheap goods. To the north and west lie flat farmland and of course the City of London, where ready markets waited for cheap brandy, tobacco and lace. When we think of smugglers, we tend to think of Robin Hood type figures that cheated the rich and helped the poor. And this is the direct result of writers such as Russell Thorndike, whose novels and films featuring the Scarecrow of Romney Marsh tended to romanticise such characters. But in actual fact, smugglers used brutal tactics and their actions were far from heroic. Smuggling in Kent goes a long way back, all the way back to the 13th century in fact. Back in those days, smugglers weren't bringing contraband into the country, they were smuggling contraband out, and that contraband was simply wool. Back in those days, Kent had an absolute abundance of sheep. You only have to look at Kent place names to see the connections. For example, the Isle of Sheppey takes its name simply from Sheep Island. Back in those days, the best weavers in the entire world were based just across the Channel in France. They were Protestants and they were known as the Huguenots. Smugglers of wool were known as owlers, partly because they operated in the dead of night and also because they communicated with each other using the twit-twoo owl signal. But as time passed by and the 16th century arrived, the trade was about to take a different path. Sat on the throne of England was that red-headed tyrant Henry VIII, whose reformation of the church would one day make England a safe haven for Protestant refugees. It wasn't until years after Henry's death, when Elizabeth I would sit on the throne of England, when these changes would really be felt, when tens of thousands of Huguenots would arrive on our shores, fleeing religious persecution in France and Belgium. The Huguenots were highly skilled and they were welcomed with open arms. Many people in England descend from the Huguenots, including the ex-UKIP leader, Mr. Nigel Farage. Of course, the Huguenots brought their weaving industry with them and established themselves in the city of Canterbury. The industry grew very quickly and within 2 decades at its height employed roughly 1/3 of Canterbury's population. Canterbury had a population in those days of around 12,000 people, so roughly 4,000 people were employed in the weaving industry, with up to 2,000 weaving looms in operation at any one time within the city walls. As a result, Kent smugglers had no need to move wool across the English Channel. So the smuggling trade turned on its head. It went from an export trade to an import trade, with smugglers looking at new cargoes which offered a much higher profit margin. For example, you could buy a tub of brandy on the continent for £1 and sell it for £4 here in Kent. Other cargoes such as tea offered an even greater profit margin. You could buy £1 of tea for 3p in France and sell it here in Kent for 25p. One of the main reasons why Kent smugglers were so successful is down to the simple fact that in those days the fastest way across the English Channel was by rowing boat, and these rowing boats were absolute monsters. They were 40 feet long and 7 feet wide, with 12 oars on each side. They could make the coastline of France in less than 5 hours. A Customs and Excise officer once described trying to catch one of these rowing vessels using a clipper, like sending a cow to catch a hare. In fact, these rowing vessels were so fast they could even outpace steam ships. Smuggling in Kent became a huge problem in the 1740s, which was when large gangs became involved in the trade, tempted by the profits smuggling offered. The largest of these gangs was known as the Hawkhurst Gang, and their territory quickly spread across the entire county. They would line up along shorelines hundreds strong, landing cargoes in broad daylight, gripping cudgels in their hands and outnumbering customs and excise dozens to one. When customs and excise caught them, they would bribe them, and when that didn't work, they would resort to violence. In 1769, a Broadstairs smuggler known as Snelling was unloading a boat full of contraband on a Thanet beach when he was set upon by a customs and excise officer and a number of soldiers. In the fight that followed, 10 smugglers were mortally wounded and 8 were captured. Snelling himself managed to escape with 4 of his men. When the customs and excise officer gave chase, he was promptly shot. This wasn't a standalone incident. Violent incidents were taking place all along the Kent coastline on a regular basis. In 1780, customs and excise were transporting 183 tubs of captured gin from Whitstable smugglers. They were removing the captured gin from Whitstable, taking it towards Canterbury. As they started to climb Borstal Hill on the outskirts of Whitstable, they were set upon by over 50 smugglers. In the fight that followed, 2 soldiers were killed before the smugglers made off with the gin. The time for someone to make a stand had arrived, and that someone was this man, William Pitt the Younger. He took office at the tender age of 24, the youngest Prime Minister this country's ever had. People laughed, saying that nations would stand and stare at the country left to a schoolboy's care. But these people massively underestimated Pitt's mathematical genius. Pitt also took office as Chancellor of the Exchequer, and he held both positions simultaneously for the best part of 20 years. He immediately spotted the huge loss in revenue smuggling was causing, and he swore to wipe out smuggling once and for all. Picking the town with the worst reputation in the entire country for smuggling, William Pitt the Younger sent 1,000 soldiers into the town of Deal in 1784. They simply marched along the seafront, pouring oil over every seaworthy vessel. And in front of the townfolk, they lit the boats, destroying the town's livelihood. Of course, smugglers earn immense fortunes, so they quickly rebuilt their fleets. It was the poor fishermen who suffered for many years to come. To give you an idea of the huge profits involved in smuggling, I'll tell you a story about one of the most successful gangs smuggling in Kent. They were known as the Sea Salter Gang. They operated out of Parsonage Farm in Sea Salter near Whitstable. They used a very effective way of communicating to each other. During the daytime, they would put brooms up certain chimneys as a warning system from house to house. During the evenings, they would light candles in certain windows. This system of communication was so effective that if customs and excise officers left the city of Canterbury on the way to Whitstable, Whitstable smugglers could receive warning they were on their way before the customs and excise officers had reached the outskirts of Canterbury. To put their success in context, when a member of the Sea Salter Gang died in 1812, he left over £1 million in his will. In today's money, that's over £200 million. On paper, this man earned a living as a cow herder. In 1816, a completely new tactic was employed to finally wipe out smuggling along the Kent coast with the formation of the Coastal Blockade Force. Originally, they monitored the coast between the North and the South Foreland, but it was so successful it quickly spread north all the way to the Isle of Sheppey and south all the way to Chichester. In 1831, the Coastal Blockade Force handed over to what's now the modern day Coast Guard. And in 1845, the Coast Guard promised that smuggling was no more along the Kent coastline. However, who's to say that the Coast Guard hadn't been bought off, like the Customs and Excise had many years earlier? I hope you've enjoyed this week's episode. Feel free to subscribe to the Kent History channel on YouTube and follow us on Facebook. I'll see you all next week.